We would like to acknowledge and praise the joint efforts of all parties since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change commenced over 20 years ago, and applaud the global actions on climate change that have made progress but continue to work on numerous difficulties and challenges we face as a nation and facet worldwide. Today, at this Paris Agreement, we must agree to meet the goals of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We must stimulate global efforts and encourage worldwide participation, and continue to strive towards a bigger and better future with the fight against climate change omniscient in our minds.
Climate change refers to the long-term change in both global and regional weather patterns, such as increased atmospheric temperature. There are many contributors to climate change, such as solar and volcanic activity. However, consensus is substantial that human behavior, as suggested by climatologists, contribute to 97% of the world's increased climate change, with fossil fuel combustion and deforestation labelled as the main causes. In 2013, statistics show the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases was at its highest level in 800,000 years from the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and thus action must be taken to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases produced and shift towards cleaner forms of energy such as solar and wind power. Currently, China's population is rapidly increasing, comprising of 1.38 billion people and taking up 18.47% of the world's population. China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and contributes to a large-scale percentage to the world's greenhouse gas emissions. However, with continuous prevention and reduced growth in demand for electricity and fossil fuels, China's emissions will steadily reduce. Now I will pass you on to our political advisor Liz to discuss the political structure of China.
To be able to understand the action that has and will be put in place by our government against climate change, the understanding of how our policies are made and who contributes to the national plans of combating climate change is extremely important. We are currently under the rule of a Communist Party known as the CCP, which stands for the Chinese Communist Party. This leading party has been in power since 1949 and is able to predetermine issues that will be addressed. Combined with the legislative party being the National People's Congress and the Cabinet Party being the State Council, decisions are made by a combination of interrelations between all three parties. Within the State Council, multiple departments specifically relate to climate change. These include Ministry of Water Resources, Bureau of Forestry, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Housing and Rural Urban Development, and lastly, the Ministry of Finance. Although there are many different departments addressing these challenges of climate change, our local governments are able to provide a more direct approach to this problem, addressing communities on a more personal level. Xi Jinping is the president of the CCP, claiming the role as our core leader, ultimately having great power and control over the Politburo, this group being able to finalise any decisions that is addressed in our government. Since Xi Jinping is the core leader, his opinions and decisions can sway what is determined. Li Keqiang, however, is our premier of China's State Council in the People's Republic of China. He assumed this role in the year 2013. Mainly his responsibilities are closely related to people of the country, concerning himself with affairs that directly affect the well-being of the populace, thus directly relating to the effects of climate change. The PCR, standing for the People's Republic of China, largely controlled the planning of climate change policies that are put forward. Policies that are related to climate change are created by using a domestic policy framework. An example of this would be the fact that different ministers and departments that fall under the State Council and PCR are required to contribute to policies being put forward against climate change. In 2007, China formally publicised a 2-year formulated document called the National Climate Change Program in response to global warming. This document analysed the future challenges we will face in response to climate change. It also describes the policies we create and how we will interact with other countries who are also facing the difficulties of climate change. Since the creation of the National Climate Change Program, many other policies and regimes have been developed in response to our climate change on a more forceful level. An example of this would be the Energy Conservation Law that was introduced in April of 2008. The Kyoto Protocol played an important role in paving the way for us to implement more effective policies in the years to follow its introduction. The Kyoto Protocol is made up of 149 countries and regions in a legally binding international treaty that obligated them to reduce their industrialized production of greenhouse gases or GHGs and their emissions. For the Chinese, the Kyoto Protocol came into effect during 2005. As a result of this milestone, it helped us sway the country to improve their overall environmental effects. A positive outcome that came to rise in heat of the Kyoto Protocol was the mechanism called the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. This mechanism aids fast-developing countries like us meet the Kyoto Protocol by allowing them to invest in environmental projects in other overseas developing countries. Thus, the CDM urges industrialized nations to share technology to aid developing countries have more effective measures against climate change. A statistic that shows how effective the CDM has become would be since July 2011, 1,484 Chinese-based CDM programs have been documented through the United Nations, thus accounting for approximately 45.5% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. We are a vast country, and therefore meaning the effectiveness of climate change policies need to be taken account by their ability to influence the domestic lives of our citizens. However, the Kyoto Protocol has slowly been on the decline of its effectiveness since 2012, thus meaning we need to continue to introduce new and successful policies. The overall decrease in policies created by our ministers and government could be since our government is taking on ambitious approaches to the policies being introduced and setting high goals for their future. If we were to set small goals and targets in eliminating our overall greenhouse emissions, more realistic outcomes will be more likely to occur. Now, I'll pass you on to our environmental and public health expert, Ben Edwards, to discuss the drastic effects on climate change upon our country.
巴黎协议应该着眼于强化2020年后全球应对气候变化行动，也要为推动全球更好实现可持续发展注入动力。 巴黎协议应该有利于加大投入，强化行动保障。发达国家应该落实到2020年每年动员1000亿美元的承诺。
China resides in an area of Asia that is divided into 5 climatic zones: cold temperate, temperate, warm temperate, tropical, and subtropical. Within each of these zones, climate change has profoundly different consequences. For instance, frequent flooding in southern coastal China ravages an average of 23 million hectares of land each year. Likewise, in North China, the aggravation of seasonal temperatures is accelerating the rate of permafrost and glaciers melting and disappearing. These contribute to climate change as it results in the release of methane, a potent greenhouse gas that thereafter is a factor in triggering extreme weather and natural disasters. China's temperate and tropical areas also experience these extreme weather events, but are particularly susceptible to frequent natural disasters, including forest fires, heat waves, cyclones, and droughts. In temperate and warm temperate zones, where the majority of China's rural and urban inhabitants reside, 70% of Chinese people and 80% of their industries and cities are already seriously threatened by natural disasters, and these harmful effects will continue if climate change is not addressed immediately. As well as the rural areas, climate change has a drastic effect on Chinese urban sectors. This has come about because of our heavy reliance on coal as an energy source. From 1990 to 2010, our total coal consumption has increased from 1.06 million tonnes to 3.5 million short tonnes. While our coal industries have brought wealth to China, it has released a large amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, deteriorating the environment in surrounding urban Chinese areas. As an environmental report suggests, increased greenhouse gases have also driven the rise of extreme weather events, which poses a grave threat to our infrastructure. For example, flooding in eastern cities is predicted to severely impact on water and electricity supplies, roads, rail and air networks, and all of these are also essential to China's industrial sector. In China's rural agricultural sector, climate change is having the heaviest influence. This is because, compared with other developing countries, China is more dependent on its agricultural activities, possessing an area of 122 million hectares, which accounts for 12.7% of the national territory area. In 2014, the Fifth Assessment Report presented a bleak picture for Chinese agriculture in the future. It highlighted significant temperature rises of 1.3 to 2.1 degrees Celsius by 2020 and 2.3 to 3.3 degrees Celsius by 2050, and also the reduction of grasslands as a result of elevated rates of desertification and forest fires. Several climate change studies suggest that if climate change trends continue, much of Chinese agriculture is likely to face shorter growing periods that increase water deficits, requiring more irrigation. Furthermore, by 2050, Chinese crop production will decrease by 10%. These agricultural problems are to be felt mostly by rural villages, as these areas are more vulnerable and less able to cope with due to poverty and existing research scarcities. Another major environmental concern we face is the depletion of freshwater resources. Freshwater is an indispensable natural resource for the survival of human beings and also an economic resource that supports the development of developing nations' economy. However, due to climatic factors, water in China is no longer an exhaustible natural resource. Our main supply of fresh water is out of rivers, which mostly comes from the accumulation of ice in the west. Hence, rapid temperature changes are a deciding factor in the amount of water that China receives. If the temperature is too cold, ice jam floods may appear in the rivers and cut off the flow of water, diminishing China's supply. If the temperature is too hot, droughts become more frequent, which dries up the rivers, leading to freshwater scarcities. Both of these resource problems are made worse by the fact that the whole Chinese population is supported by only 6% of fresh water supplied by rivers. According to the Chinese Meteorological Administration, a deprivation of water resource could increase the potential for tensions between Chinese provinces, leading to intra and interstate conflicts. Transitioning down to the coast, climate change has created an abundance of crises which have threatened the living conditions of the region's ecology and people. These include rising sea levels and pollution to coastal waters. One study by the research team of climate change predicts that by 2050, sea levels along China's coast will rise to between 15 to 26 centimeters and 40 to 70 centimeters by 2100. This is impactful, as if anticipated trends are to continue as they are now, all of China's 32,000 kilometers of densely populated coastline will eventually be underwater. Coastal China is also seeing a reduction in water quality and offshore ecosystems as a result of pollution. In 2008, environmental administrators stated that both of these pollution problems are owed to the discharge of large amounts of industrial waste and sewage with nitrogenous organic compounds into the sea. This subsequently leads to the explosive proliferation of red tide algae and a phenomenon known as red tides, in which the seawater drastically changes color. When a red tide occurs, it is accompanied by the releasing of harmful gases and toxins, which further pollutes the coastal environment, leading to the death of marine ecosystems. Yet another environmental problem is the effect of pollution on our people's health. As a result of our reliance on using coal as an energy source, we have released a thick smog that has blanketed a significant portion of the country. In 2013, this smog was estimated to have covered 2.7 million square kilometres, producing high air pollution that has affected more than 600 million people with greater health concerns, such as pulmonary, cardiovascular, and respiratory diseases. Additionally, in 2016, air pollution was estimated to have caused between 300,000 and 750,000 annual premature deaths in China. In rural areas, the higher risk of pollution in China has significantly increased the incidence of cancer to such an extent that they have been labelled cancer villages by other developing countries. Between 1990 and 2004, cancer has made up 50% of all deaths in these villages. At the same time, these 247 cancer villages are victim to disproportionate annual numbers of cases of infertility and birth complications, along with other grievous illnesses.
The impacts caused by climate change are inevitable and is becoming beyond the current ability to cope with, especially in the community and on an individual level. Since 1996, there has been a vast number of protests in China towards the eroding environment, which has been on an increase of 29% per year. Similarly, during the 11th five-year plan, 300,000 protests were received in regards to public, environmental, and health matters. According to one study, a group of younger Chinese citizens suggested the Chinese government should put more effort into reducing greenhouse gas emissions and working with the public. Similarly, the study shows that the public possess three concerns in response to climate change, including a general concern about climate change, a concern on the impact on us as individuals, and concerns on the impacts of society and the environment. When asking the public about the causes of climate change, it is evident that 27% believe that climate change is due to natural causes, and 85% believe or agree to a certain extent that it is due to human activities, such as greenhouse gas emissions. From this, 71% of people interviewed in another study gave their support to the government in curbing greenhouse gas emissions, as their biggest concern was air pollution and how this will affect upcoming generations. We will now present a short video depicting the Chinese public's outcry and concern for climate change.
Can reduce a person's life expectancy by 20 minutes. It's akin to being a heavy smoker, smoking a pack and a half of cigarettes every day. So we wanted to know, how are people in this city coping with the bad air?
I'm trying to avoid going outside. My throat hurts. I think people should drive less and all the factories should be shut down.
I don't have a face mask. I am used to the bad air now because I always work on the streets. On days like this, it's very easy to fall ill. The smog definitely harms people's health.
I will now pass you on to Sam, our prevention and solutionist expert, to discuss the previous and current achievements of China in regards to climate change and how we will work to build a better future for our country and worldwide.
We have been a leading contributor in the climate change movement and have already achieved strong success in reducing carbon emissions. According to calculations by the World Bank, we have accounted for 52% of the global energy savings in the last 20 years and have 1/4 of the world's installed renewable energy generating capacity. In 2013 to 2014, we have accounted for 37 to 40% of newly installed renewable energy infrastructure. In the last decade, our hydropower has doubled, wind power has increased 60-fold, PV solar has increased 280-fold. Our government plans for the future are seen through a structure of 5-year plans, known as the FYP, which embrace our goals for climate change. The 11th 5-year plan claimed that we are facing a grim situation in addressing climate change with hard tasks, and thus our prioritization should move away from economic growth and towards environmental protection for a more equal approach. We have so far been meeting their goals for the 5-year plans, with the GDP energy intensity dropping to 16% and carbon intensity to 17%. With a still growing economy, we have avoided 3.5 billion tons of carbon emissions. That's no easy thing. Under our national program for responding to climate change, By 2020, carbon intensity should drop by 40 to 50%, with 15% of our energy coming from non-fossil fuels. The 13th five-year plan commenced in 2015, and our leadership has identified low-carbon technologies as the technology of the future. They have seen the opportunity for us to establish ourselves as an innovator, leader, manufacturer, and exporter of these technologies. In recent years, we have invested heavily into developing new technologies for renewable energy and alternative energy sources, as well as developing already existing technologies, such as our wind turbines. Much focus is being put on increasing energy efficiency as a way to reduce carbon emissions, as it would allow us to continue economic growth while simultaneously cutting carbon emissions. By 2015, we have invested $102.9 billion into renewable energy and installed half of the world's wind power energy, with Xi Jinping's administration adopting the phrase ecological civilization as its slogan. Our government is aware that the pollution is affecting food securities, people's health, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events such as floods and droughts, and thus immediate action needs to be taken. The regime also sees the low-carbon economy as a financial opportunity too, and the technologies we are marketing can be marketed worldwide. With our support, renewable energy is growing rapidly as a global business, considering 90% of the Chinese citizens believe that climate change is a very real threat, and the government has widespread support in their goals and has seized this opportunity to act upon the political space for action. Following on from this, we have also introduced several programs for companies to help deal with climate change, such as the Nanjing Voluntary Energy Efficiency Program, which was introduced in 2008. In this program, companies entered into an agreement to reduce energy intensity by 3 to 5% by 2009. The agreement was flexible and allowed for companies to have variable goals based off their capacity to address the issues. Companies are encouraged to join to develop stronger relations with the Nanjing Environmental Protection Bureau and stronger public relations with the wider community. Similar projects have emerged across China following this success. We have also introduced an emissions trading scheme in 7 main cities and provinces, and are in the process of planning a national cap-and-trade scheme. We have recently funded the South-South Cooperation, paying for training in developing nations. This organization has trained around 2,000 officials and technicians throughout 120 developing nations to run projects and raise funds towards climate change. It is our aim to regularly run these South-South projects to continue helping these nations. China is also providing developing countries with energy-saving and early warning equipment. We are also targeting climate change by planting large areas of forest. Forest stocks in China should increase by 1.5 billion cubic meters. China has the largest area of planted forests in the world. These forest plantations sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, and as a result, Chinese forests are now in the net sink of the gas. In 2014, a climate agreement was signed between ourselves and the US, 2 of the world's largest carbon emitters. We pledged to commit $3.1 billion, a comparable amount to the US, to an international fund to help developing countries address global warming. Despite still being an economically developing nation, we still have lower emissions per capita than the developed world. Furthermore, 26% of our carbon emissions come from manufacturing goods for the West, and so we argue that the West should take responsibility for what they claim are exported emissions. On a local level, our government is eradicating old and inefficient cars off the road, providing buyers with incentives to buy hybrids and electric cars, and enforcing stricter fuel efficiency standards for new cars. Requirements for new buildings also emphasize energy efficiency, and older buildings are being given energy efficiency upgrades. We, as a government, realize that a wealthier population living in an industrialized country would spend a lot of time traveling, and that will increase transportation emissions. To combat this, we are rapidly building a high-speed rail network, which already has more than 11,800 miles, with the ability to carry 2.7 million riders daily, with plans to continue expanding in the near future.
Overall, China as a uniting nation put forward an endeavour to achieve the following solutions to combat climate change. Firstly, the continuation of our 5-year plans, now entering the 13th FYP, We will adopt new policy measures, build low-carbon energy systems, develop green and low-carbon transportation, as well as build a carbon emission trading market. We pledge to peak carbon dioxide emissions by 2030, and we endeavour to achieve this as soon as possible. We also aim to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in terms of gross domestic product by 60 to 65% in comparison to the 2005 carbon dioxide levels. We will increase the shares of non-fossil fuels such as hydrogen and other clean energy sources.
China has pledged to accomplish. President Jinping announced China will cap carbon dioxide emissions around 2030. They also plan on addressing renewable energy by increasing non-fossil fuel consumption to 20% of total energy used, up from 9.8% in 2013. They also have been experimenting with wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear energy sources. The question is